Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The sound that lingers is not of voices nor of bells, but of an axe striking wood, steady, rhythmic, echoing across an empty clearing where forest meets meadow. You hear the thud of iron biting oak, the groan of the tree as it sways, the final crash that shakes the ground. The air is sharp, filled with the smell of sap and earth, the sweetness of pine mingling with damp soil. In this silence, broken only by labor, a frontier cabin begins to take shape. Pause here. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the clearing. The forest looms dark and immense behind you, its canopy stretching into shadow. Head, a crude frame rises, logs stacked, their bark rough beneath calloused hands, their seams packed with moss and clay. Smoke drifts faintly from a small fire, the smell of wood smoke carrying through cold air. There are no neighbors, no bells, no markets. Only the sound of your own labor and the vastness of wilderness pressing in on every side for those who sought. Survival on the frontier, shelter was the first battle. A cabin was not comfort but necessity, a fragile wall against rain, snow, and wind. Logs cut by hand were notched together, their gaps sealed with mud and straw. Roofs were covered with shingles, split from the same trees that once shaded the forest floor. Floors were earthen, sometimes strewn with rushes or hides. Windows, if any, were crude openings covered with oil paper or cloth. In the cold months, frost still crept through cracks. Drafts whispered through seams, and snow piled high against doors. Yet within, there was fire, and fire meant survival. Pause again. You see the hearth, a rough stack of stone mortared with clay, smoke curling upward through a hole in the roof. The flame within flickers, orange against the shadows, its warmth reaching outward in fragile circles. Around it, shadows stretch and bend, filling the corners with silence. The air smells of ash and damp wool, of pine, sap, and earth. The fire is small, yet it is enough. The first cabins were often built quickly, their walls thin, their roofs leaky. Families huddled together within, their breath visible, their blankets heavy with damp. Nights were long, broken by the need to rise and feed the fire, to check livestock if they had any, to listen for sounds in the forest beyond, wolves howling, branches snapping, wind pushing against the walls. Sleep came not as comfort, but as fragments, stitched together by vigilance. And so, the cabin itself was more than shelter. It was a boundary between wilderness and survival, between silence outside and silence within. Its logs bore the marks of labor, its seams the patience of hands. The very air inside carried memory of trees felled, of clay gathered, of nights endured. The cabin was fragile, yet it was a statement that people would endure here, no matter how vast the cold, no matter how deep the forest. Pause once more. You hear the sound of wind moving through pines outside, their branches groaning softly, their needles whispering in unison. You feel the draft slipping beneath the door, cool against your skin. You hear the crackle of fire, its warmth fighting back the chill. The silence is immense, but within the cabin, a fragile circle of survival holds steady. For every frontier family, this was the beginning. A small clearing in the forest, a cabin raised by hand, a fire coaxed to life. The rest, the planting of fields, the hunting of game, the storage of food, would follow. But the cabin was first, for without walls, there was no defense against night, no refuge from storms, no chance of sleep when wolves howled. across frozen ground, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke through cracks in the logs on the edge of wilderness. Was survival truly secured by the cabin's walls, or by the will of those inside to endure through each long night, one fragile fire at a time? Asterisk. The first cabin stands, rough and low, its logs dark with sap, its seams packed with mud that already cracks in places. Winter presses close, and with it comes the knowledge that the fire inside must never be allowed to die. On the frontier, flame was not a luxury, it was the heartbeat of survival. Pause here. Imagine the hearth at night. The room is small, its roof beams blackened with smoke, its corners heavy with shadow. You lie on a straw mattress, a rough quilt pulled high, and you hear the fire crackling faintly. Its light flickers against the logs, its glow soft and orange. Outside, the forest moans in wind, branches groan, and snow falls soundlessly. But within, the fire speaks, steady, patient, unbroken. The labor of keeping it alive was endless. Logs were split by hand, carried one by one, stacked beside the hearth. At dusk, kindling was prepared carefully, small twigs and shavings set aside for the moment when embers grew weak. Through the night, someone always stirred, a parent rising quietly to add another log. A child roused to carry a stick of wood, breath misting in the air as they leaned close to coax the flames. To let the fire die was to wake in silence, colder than stone. To find water frozen in buckets, frost on blankets, life itself pushed to the edge. Pause again. You hear the faint sound of a poker scraping across embers, the sudden hiss as sparks leap upward, the sigh of relief as flame rises again. The cabin grows warmer, though the cold still waits just beyond the walls. For fuel, settlers turned first to the forest. Trees fell in steady rhythm. Oak, hickory, pine, their trunks split into logs, their branches gathered for kindling. But wood was not only for burning, teed was for building, for tools, for fences. Each tree cut carried a choice, and each log consumed by fire was both warmth and loss. Families measured their days in cords of wood, their nights in logs consumed. Children learned early to carry sticks, to blow on embers, to guard coals beneath ash. The hearth was the center of life, the place where meals were cooked, where stories were told, where prayers were whispered before sleep. Its smoke filled the cabin, stung eyes, darkened rafters, but no one complained. Smoke meant survival. Absence meant danger. Pause once more. You feel the sting of smoke in your eyes, the weight of wool heavy with its smell, the taste of ash faint on your lips. You breathe it in, not as discomfort, but as the rhythm of living dot in the wilderness. Matches and flint were not always easy to come by. A single coal preserved overnight could mean the difference between safety and hardship. Families buried embers beneath ash at dusk, their glow lasting until morning, when breath and tinder brought them back to life. Neighbors, when they existed, shared flame as readily as food. To lend fire was to lend survival itself, a gift more precious than coin. And yet, fire was danger too. Cabins built of logs, sealed with pitch and straw, could catch quickly. A spark on a blanket, a coal fallen to the floor, could turn survival into ruin. Families slept lightly, ears tuned to the crackle of flame, eyes half open to its glow. Fire was both guardian and threat, both companion and warning. It demanded respect as much as vigilance. Through the night, the fire spoke softly, a language of crackles and hisses, of logs collapsing, of sparks leaping and vanishing. Sleep was shaped by its rhythm, broken by the need to rise and tend. It soothed by its steady presence. The fire never slept, and so neither did those who lived by it. Pause again. Imagine waking in the deep hours, the cabin silent, the fire nearly gone. You rise, shivering, your feet cold against the floor, your breath white in the air. You stir the embers, add a log, and watch as flame rises once more. Its glow spreads across the room, your body warms, and you lie down again, your sleep stitched together by its patience, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke into rafters on the frontier. Was survival found in the strength of cabins, or in the fragile, flickering fire that never slept through the long winter night? Asterisk. The forest beyond the cabin is dark, its branches bending under snow, its silence deepened by frost. Wolves prowl at the edges, their howls rising faintly, carried by the wind. The river is frozen, its current hidden beneath a crust of ice that groans as the night grows colder. Inside the cabin, the fire burns low again, and sleep settles not as comfort, but as endurance. Pause here. Imagine lying beneath a quilt stitched from scraps of wool, your breath misting above your face. Around you, the room is dim, shadows stretching into corners, the sound of wind, faint but unceasing. The logs of the cabin creak softly, contracting. In frost, the fire hisses, a log collapsing into embers. You feel the draft slip beneath the door, cool against your skin, and you pull the blanket higher. Sleep here is not gentle. It is a truce, a fragile bargain struck with cold and silence. Families learn to sleep in layers, linen closest to the skin, wool above, furs spread thickest of all. Cloaks became blankets, straw stuffed into ticking became mattresses, hides became coverings heavy enough to press bodies still. Children were tucked together, their warmth shared, their dreams softened by presence. Parents lay near the fire, their ears half awake for the sound of wolves, for the crackle of flame, for the cry of an infant stirred by the cold. Sleep was never absolute. It was a rhythm of waking and drifting, of tending fires, of listening to night. Pause again. You hear the muffled sigh of a child stirring, the quiet whisper of reassurance, the rustle of wool settling again. The fire glows faintly, its light trembling across beams darkened by smoke. The silence beyond the walls feels immense, but within, a fragile rhythm continues. Danger on the frontier did not sleep either. Wolves, bears, and even strangers sometimes pressed close to cabins, their presence felt in broken twigs, in faint tracks left in snow, in sounds carried through the stillness. Doors were barred with heavy timber, shutters nailed shut, but still the fear lingered. Men often kept weapons near, muskets leaning against walls, knives close to hand. The cold was not the only companion of the night, and yet the silence carried its own weight. Nights stretched so long that sleep seemed endless, broken only by the need to rise and tend fire. Dreams blended with waking, and hours lost meaning. Some wrote of loneliness sharper than cold, of a vast emptiness pressing close, of silence that rang louder than wolves. To survive was not only to endure frost, but to endure stillness. Pause once more. You imagine yourself waking in that silence. The fire's low, the room heavy with shadow, the only sound your own breath. You listen for danger, for movement, but hear only the faint moan of wind beyond the walls. The silence is immense, yet it feels alive, as though the wilderness itself is listening back. Morning brought little relief. The fire burned down to ash, blankets grew damp with frost, limbs stiffened with cold. Servants in towns could rise too, bells, but here, dawn was only the pale glow of light seeping through shutters. The work began immediately. Fire stirred, wood carried, snow cleared, water fetched. Survival did not pause with night, nor did it ease with morning. It was a continuum, an unbroken labor carried across every hour, and so, nights of endurance shaped frontier life. Families did not expect comfort, only persistence. They knew that each night survived was one step closer to spring, that each ember preserved was a promise of tomorrow. The wilderness was vast, but so was their patience, stretched across hours, heavy with frost and silence. Pause again. You feel the cabin breathing around you, logs creaking, fires sighing, sleepers shifting. The cold remains, but the rhythm continues. Another night passes, not in peace, but in endurance, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like frost along the edges of the shutter. In the wilderness, did survival truly rest in cabins and fire, or in the quiet endurance of bodies that refused to yield night after night until spring returned? Asterisk, the forest has grown quiet under the weight of snow. The tracks of deer vanish into drifts. The river groans beneath ice, and the fields once green with corn now lie barren, their stubble pale against the frost. Inside the cabin, the fire burns low, and beside it sit barrels, sacks, and bundles, the fur stores gathered in hope that they might last until spring thaws here. Imagine the sight of those stores. A barrel of salted pork, its brine sharp. In the air, sack of dried beans, their hard shells rattling like stones when moved. Corn hung in braided ropes from rafters, their kernels hard as glass, gleaming faintly in the firelight. A crock of lard sealed with cloth, its surface glistening. Each item is more than food. It is a fragment of survival, a memory of autumn harvests, a promise against the hunger of winter. The frontier was not kind to those unprepared. Crops could fail, game could vanish, storms could linger. Food was never a certainty, only a hope, secured by labor months before. In autumn, families harvested feverishly, gathering corn, beans, pumpkins, and potatoes. They salted meat, smoked fish, dried fruit in the last warmth of the sun. Cellars were dug, lined with logs, filled with jars and barrels. Yet even with such care, there was never certainty. Hunger was always near, waiting beyond the fire's glow. Pause again. You hear the sound of beans poured into a pot, their rattle sharp against the silence. You smell pork sizzling faintly in its fat, the air thick with smoke. The fire crackles, the pot bubbles. The smell fills the room, yet you know the meal is small, the portions measured, the hunger only eased. Never banished, meals on the frontier were plain, repetitive, often meager. Cornbread made from ground, meal baked on a stone near the fire. Beans simmered with salt pork, their broth thick but simple. Dried apples softened in water, their sweetness faint, almost forgotten. On rare days, venison or rabbit, its smell rich, its taste cherished. But there was no variety, no luxury, only fuel for bodies laboring against cold. Children learned early that food could not be wasted. Every crust of bread, every kernel of corn, every spoon of beans mattered. Mothers measured portions carefully, setting aside enough for tomorrow, for next week, for next month. Hunger sharpened patience, but it also taught fear, the fear of watching barrels empty, of hearing the hollow echo of a cellar, of knowing that winter was not yet over. Pause once more. Imagine sitting before the hearth with a wooden bowl in your hands. Stew is thin, the bread coarse, but its warmth fills you for a moment. You sip slowly, savoring each taste, knowing there is no more than what has been given. Outside, the wind howls, the snow presses higher against the door, and you realize that each bite is borrowed time. Frontier families told stories of winters when hunger took lives, when neighbors starved, when families boiled leather or stripped bark from trees to survive. Such memories lingered like shadows, shaping every harvest, every meal, every prayer before eating. Food was never only sustenance, was memory, fear, and hope bound together in each bite. And so, the hearth became more than fire. It was the place where hunger was measured, where meals were stretched, where hope was boiled in thin broth. Families gathered there not only for warmth, but for reassurance. that they might endure another day. The fire's glow fell upon barrels and sacks, casting shadows long as though reminding all that stores, like flames, would not last forever. Pause again. You hear the bubbling of a pot, the faint scrape of a ladle, the soft sound of a child, chewing slowly, carefully. The cabin is quiet, the fire steady, the meal small. Yet, within that moment, lies endurance, fragile but unbroken, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like steam rising from a bowl in the wilderness, with survival truly fed by what lay in barrels and sacks, or by the patience to stretch each portion, each bite, each day, into a fragile thread of hope against hunger. Asterisk. The snow lies deep now, pressing against the shutters, muting every sound outside the cabin walls. The river is buried, its surface white and still, the forest branches, heavy with frost. Inside, the fire burns steady, but beside it, the barrels and sacks no longer stand as full as they once did. Each day, the portions shrink, each meal stretched thinner, each glance at the cellar more uneasy than the last. Pause here. Imagine walking down into the cellar on such a morning. The air is sharp, colder than above, damp with earth and wood. The shelves that once held rows of jars now stand half empty. The sack of beans is softer to the touch, its sides collapsing inward. The barrel of pork smells faintly of brine, but its bottom shows through where only scraps remain. You run your hand across the shelves, and the hollow sound echoes in the stillness. Hunger waits here, not in cries, but in absence. By late winter, many frontier families faced the same fear. Autumn harvests and slaughtered livestock carried them into December, but January and February stretched long, and March was longer still. What had seemed plentiful in autumn dwindled to remnants. Bread was made with less meal, stretched with ground acorns or bark. Stew was thinned further, water replacing broth, beans counted carefully. Dried fruit, once set aside as a luxury, was eaten quickly, its sweetness vanishing in the bitterness of cold months. Pause again. You picture the pot on the fire, its contents bubbling weakly, the smell faint. A few beans, a scrap of pork fat, a crust of bread sat beside it. The sound of the ladle scraping the bottom of the pot is louder than the bubbling itself, a reminder that less remains each day. Hunger sharpened every sense. Children asked for more, their voices quiet but insistent. Parents reassured them, even as their own stomachs tightened. Servants or neighbors, if they lived close enough, sometimes shared what little they had, but often they were no better off. Stories of desperate winters carried through communities, of families reduced to eating boiled leather, of grain ground with husks until it cut the tongue, of livestock slaughtered too early, leaving nothing for spring. Hunger was not only felt, it was remembered, feared, carried from year to year. Yet, even in hunger, rituals persisted. Families gathered at the hearth, as always, bowls in hand, prayers whispered over meals, however small. The fire's glow softened the fear, if only for moments. Meals became slower, bites more deliberate, every mouthful stretched as though to trick the body into believing there was more. Hunger taught patience, but it also carried silence. Conversations grew shorter, laughter rarer, the weight of emptiness pressing down upon words. Pause once more. Imagine sitting with a wooden bowl in your lap, its contents thin. You sip slowly, the taste faint but filling for a moment. Around you, others eat in silence, the firelight flickering across faces drawn and pale. Outside, the wind moans against shutters. The snow creaks as it shifts. Hunger is not loud, it's heavy, pressing, unspoken. Some winters were harsher still. Diaries and letters tell of families who lost livestock to disease. Fields had yielded poorly the year before, who faced cold months with little more than roots and scraps. In such times, survival meant sacrifice. Parents often ate less to leave more for children. Stronger siblings carried weaker ones through days of labor. Food was traded or begged from neighbors, though many had none to give. Every meal was an act of calculation. How much to eat today? How much to save for tomorrow? How long to stretch until spring? The cold made everything harder. Water froze before it could be drunk. The bread hardened quickly in the air. Even the act of chewing felt laborious when bodies were weary. And yet, people endured. They endured because they had no choice, because survival was not measured in comfort, but in persistence. Hunger did not end nights. It filled them, and still, they slept when they could. Their dreams often haunted by the smell of bread or the sight of green fields that would return only months later. Pause again. Hear the faint crackle of fire, the soft rattle of beans in the bottom of a pot, the sigh of someone setting their bowl aside, finished though not filled. The silence that follows is heavy, but it is also endurance. Another meal has passed, another day survived, and you were left with a reflection that drifts like steam from an empty bowl. On the frontier, did survival rest in the food itself, or in the quiet will to stretch hunger into patience, carrying bodies and spirits forward until the earth thawed again? Asterisk. The snow has crusted hard now, its surface glittering pale beneath the moon. The river lies silent, its ice thick and stubborn, its current muffled beneath layers of frost. The forest stands, brittle, its branches sharp against the sky, its silence broken only by the crack of trees splitting in cold. Inside the cabin, the fire burns low again, and the food stores are nearly gone. Hunger is no longer a distant fear. It is present, pressing, a companion that lingers in every breath. Pause here. Imagine sitting near the hearth, staring into its embers. The pot hangs empty, its bottom scraped clean, its iron surface blackened with use. Beside you, the sack of beans has collapsed into a heap of cloth, its contents no more than a handful. The barrel of pork holds only brine, its scraps long since eaten. The shelves are bare, the cellar hollow. Each glance at them reminds you that spring has not yet come. Late winter was the hardest season of all. Crops from the year before had dwindled. Game was scarce in the frozen forest. Rivers yielded no fish. Its fields lay buried, their soil waiting beneath frost, their promise still months away. The days stretched short, the nights longer still, and each week that passed carried families deeper into uncertainty. Hunger was not only a tightening of the stomach, it was the weight of time itself, the knowledge that the earth still slept and that life waited upon its waking. Pause again. You hear the sound of snow shifting outside, the crack of ice along the river, the faint creak of the cabin settling. Within, the silence is heavier. No bowls clatter, no smells of stew rise from the hearth. Only the fire speaks, its crackle quiet, its warmth fragile. When food ran out, people turned to what remained, roots dug from beneath frozen earth, bitter and hard, acorns ground into coarse meal, their taste sharp, their texture rough, bark peeled from trees, boiled into weak broth, offering little more than warmth to the stomach. Leather was softened, scraped, boiled until it could be chewed. None of it was satisfying, none of it nourishing enough, but it was something, and, in the absence of plenty, something was survival. Children often fared worst. Their bodies needed more. Their cries for food pierced through the silence. Parents gave from their own portions, leaving themselves weaker. Letters from the time speak of mothers who ate almost nothing, saving every crumb for their children, whispering comfort even as their own strength failed. Hunger shaped not only the body, but the bonds of family, pressing sacrifice into every decision, neighbors, if any, might share, though often they were no better off. The gift of a small sack of meal, of a rabbit trapped in the forest, of a few apples stored through frost, was more than kindness. It was life itself. Communities survived together or not at all. Hunger drew people closer, bound them in shared endurance. Pause once more. Imagine the knock of a neighbor at your door, the sound muffled by snow. They bring a small sack, its contents little, yet you see their relief when you accept it. Your thanks is whispered, your voice thin, but it carries meaning greater than words. Hunger is shared, but so is survival. And then, slowly, the change began. Days lengthened by a few moments, the sun lingering longer upon the snow. Birds returned in faint flocks, their calls sharp against the silence. Ice cracked along the river's surface, water showing in dark seams. The forest softened, its edges less brittle. Spring announced itself, not with abundance, but with the smallest signs: green shoots breaking through thawing soil, sap rising in trees, the first fish caught beneath melting ice. These signs brought relief, though food remained scarce. Early greens, nettles, dandelion leaves, wild onions were gathered eagerly, their sharp flavors welcome after months of sameness. Fish caught in swollen rivers filled pots again, their smell rich, their taste abundant after hunger. Maple sap was boiled into syrup, its sweetness treasured, its presence proof that the land still gave. The first rabbit trapped in spring was feast enough to bring tears. Pause again. You smelled the sharpness of wild greens simmering in a pot, their steam rising, their taste bitter but alive. You hear the sound of fish sizzling on a skillet, their flesh crisping in fire. The meal is simple, but compared to winter's emptiness, it feels like a banquet. Hunger did not vanish quickly. It lingered through spring, its memory carried in weak bodies, in stores that remained empty until the first harvest. But the fear lifted, the sound of birds, the sight of fields thawing, the feel of warmth on the skin. These promised that endurance had not been in vain. Families rose from winter, not unchanged, but stronger in patience, bound in memory, shaped by survival. And so, frontier life was not measured only in cabins or in fields, but in the long nights of hunger endured, in the patience stretched across months, in the hope carried into spring. Hunger was never absent. It's woven into the rhythm of life, teaching endurance as surely as fire taught vigilance. Pause once more. You sit at the hearth again, now with a bowl of greens before you, the fire burning brighter. Outside, the snow melts in streams, the ground softens, the air fills with birdsong. Hunger has not vanished, but it has loosened its grip. You breathe easier, though the memory remains, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like mist. Across thawing fields was survival on the frontier, truly won by what was gathered and stored, or by the endurance to wait through hunger and silence until the earth itself awoke again. Asterisk. The morning begins not with the crow of a rooster, nor the toll of a bell, but with the slow creak of a wooden bucket being lifted from its peg. Before the hearth is stirred, before the first cornmeal is poured into the pot, water must be fetched. The stream lies just beyond the cabin's clearing, a ribbon of cold silver winding through forest and field. Its sound is faint, a murmur, beneath bird calls, yet its presence shapes every day of life on the frontier. Pause here. Imagine stepping outside the cabin at dawn. The air is sharp, carrying the scent of frost and pine. The sky is pale, its colors fading from deep indigo to faint rose. Beneath your feet, the ground is stiff, the grass brittle with dew or ice. You carry a yoke across your shoulders, buckets swinging gently from its hooks. The forest looms close, its shadows still heavy, its silence broken by the occasional rustle of a branch. Ahead, you hear the low whisper of water, steady, patient, unbroken. For settlers, water was both necessity and burden. Streams and rivers offered life for drinking, for cooking, for washing, for animals. Yet, they required labor every day, in all weathers. Cots were filled and hauled back, heavy and sloshing, their weight pressing into shoulders, their contents spilling with each step. A family of 5 or 6 might need dozens of trips each day. Wells, when dug, eased the burden, but they were costly, dangerous, and slow to construct. For most, the stream remained the lifeline. Pause again. You hear the splash as a bucket dips into the stream, the creak of its handle, the slow sound of water pouring back into itself. You feel the cold spray against your hands, the weight of the bucket as you lift it high. The water gleams in faint light, reflecting branches overhead, the surface rippling as though alive. Yet, water was never simply carried. It had to be guarded, kept clean, preserved against freezing. Buckets were covered with cloth to keep out dirt, stored near the hearth to prevent ice, emptied at night to avoid waste. In winter, streams froze, forcing people to break ice with axes, to kneel on snow and scoop water from dark holes. Fingers numbed, breath rose in clouds, and buckets grew heavier still as frost clung to their sides. The labor of water shaped every task. Meals could not be cooked without it. Clothes could not be washed. Wounds could not be cleaned. Stock needed troughs filled. Fields needed irrigation. The carrying of water was endless, repetitive, and yet it was sacred too. Every drop represented survival, every trip a thread tying the cabin to the land around it, the land around it. Pause once more. Imagine setting the buckets down by the hearth. The water sloshes, its surface trembling. Steam rises faintly as it warms near the fire. You see your reflection in its surface, pale, blurred, softened by ripples. The sound of the forest lingers still in your ears, but the hearth calls. The day unfolding one necessity at a time. Disease, too, lurked in water. Streams carried more than fish. They carried runoff, waste, the unseen spread of sickness. Dysentery, cholera, fevers, all could pass silently through a bucket carried home. Families boiled water when they could, though fuel was precious, and fires demanded effort. Many drank straight from streams, trusting clarity to mean safety. Some survived, others did not. Still, the stream remained. Its murmur filled the silence of night. Its glimmer guided footsteps at dawn. In its water was risk, but also life. It gave fields their green, filled pots with broth, washed faces weary from labor. Settlers lived by its rhythm, their days shaped by its distance, its depth, its patience. Pause again. You hear its murmur now, steady and low, as though the land itself whispers through it. You feel its coldness in your hands, its weight on your shoulders, its presence woven into every hour, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like ripples across the surface. On the frontier, survival found in the cabins and fires, or in the endless journey to the stream, where water was lifted each day as both burden and gift. Asterisk, the stream may have given enough for daily life, but the river was something larger, something deeper. It was not fetched each day, yet its presence shaped every settlement. Wide, slow, and sometimes treacherous, it offered fish, carried logs, marked boundaries. It's whispered constantly in the background of frontier survival. Pause here. Imagine standing on its bank in winter. The air is sharp, carrying the faint smell of mud and frozen reeds. The river's surface is glazed with ice in places, cracked in others where dark water shows through. The sound is faint, a low groan as ice shifts, a muffled ripple beneath the crust. Around you, the world is still, the trees skeletal, the ground stiff. The river does not rest even beneath ice. Its silence is only another form of movement. For frontier families, rivers were lifelines. They brought fish, perch, pike, trout, catfish, pulled from the water with nets or spears, smoked over fire, stored for weeks. They offered transport, though rafts and canoes were fragile against currents and ice. They marked the edge of claims, serving as maps before maps were drawn. A river was both boundary and passage, both provider and danger. Pause again. Hear the splash of a net cast wide, the faint rustle of reeds, the sudden tug as fish struggle against its cords. The sound carries across still air, louder than it should, echoing against water and wood. You smell the sharpness of scales, the dampness of mud. The catch is small, but its weight in hand feels like endurance. Yet rivers carried risk as much as life. In spring, they flooded, spreading ice and debris, sweeping away cabins built too near. In winter, their ice was both bridge and trap, thick enough to walk one day, treacherous the next. Children sometimes wandered too close, their feet breaking through, their cries carried away. Men with axes cut holes for water, for fish, for washing, kneeling on brittle ice as it groaned beneath them. Each trip was a gamble, yet still they returned, for without water there was no survival. Disease, too, followed rivers. Stagnant pools bred fevers, insects rose thick in summer, waste carried downstream spread unseen harm. Yet no family could live without them. Wells were rare, costly, dangerous to dig, their walls collapsing in soil. The river remained the heart, patient and relentless, asking labor each season, offering life with one hand, threat with the other. Pause once more. You kneel on its bank, dipping a bucket through thin ice. The water is so cold, it stings, your fingers numb before you lift it free. The bucket sloshes, heavier with each step as you carry it back. Behind you, the river murmurs, endless, unchanged, sound that will outlast the cabin, the family, even the memory of this place. Rivers shaped not only work, but fear. They were places where strangers crossed, traders, wanderers, sometimes enemies. Their banks carried tracks, prints pressed into mud, signs that others had passed by. At night, the sound of the river carried into cabins, a reminder that survival was not only about cold or hunger, but about who else might share these woods. The river was a boundary between known and unknown, comfort and unease. And yet, for all its silence, it was also companionship. Families spoke of lying awake at night, hearing its low murmur beyond the walls, steady and calm, like breath from the land itself. Children fell asleep to its sound. Women whispered prayers to it. Men rose at dawn to walk its banks. Its constancy was a reminder that the wilderness was not empty, that the earth still moved, even when fields lay barren. Pause again. You hear it now, the low ripple beneath ice, the faint groan of shifting crust, the murmur that continues, whether noticed or not. It is not loud, but it is endless, filling silence with presence. And you are left with a reflection that drifts like mist above its surface. On the frontier, did families truly live by what they built within cabins, or by the slow, silent patience of rivers, carrying life and loss in equal measure through the wilderness? Asterisk, the stream gave water day by day. The river offered life in flood, in fish, in transport, in threat. But for many who remained on the frontier, neither was enough. Too distant, too dangerous, too uncertain in seasons when ice locked the surface or drought left beds cracked. And so, with effort that could span weeks, settlers turned to the earth itself. They dug wells, dark, narrow shafts cut into soil and stone, so that water might rest within reach of their own door. Pause here. Imagine standing at the lip of a new well. The earth around it smells of damp clay, sharp and mineral. its walls raw with layers of soil exposed. A wooden frame rises above, crude but sturdy, with a rope wound round a creaking spindle. A bucket hangs, swaying slightly in morning wind. You hear the faint drip of water below, unseen but present, as though the ground itself is breathing. Wells were lifelines, but they were dangerous to make. Men dug by hand, lowering themselves into narrow shafts with shovels, baskets, picks. The air grew stale, the light dim, the earth heavy above them. Sometimes walls collapsed, burying the laborer in silence. Sometimes water never appeared. No matter how deep they dug, the soil dry and stubborn. When success came, when the spade struck dampness, when water seeped into darkness, the well became a treasure more valuable than gold. Pause again. You hear the creak of rope as the bucket is lowered, the faint splash as it strikes the water below. A moment of silence follows. Then the bucket rises again, heavy, dripping, gleaming in pale light. You feel the weight of it in your hands, cool against your palms, the surface trembling as you carry it toward the hearth. With the well, water was nearer, yet it still demanded care. Buckets had to be drawn each day, their ropes fraying, their handles worn smooth. Wells needed covering, their mouths guarded against children falling, against animals wandering too close. Insects gathered in their depths. Frogs sometimes climbed their stones. Yet, for all their imperfections, wells eased the endless trek, too. Rivers spared bodies from the ache of carrying water across fields. They tied life more closely to cabins, anchoring families to the land. And still, water was never certain. Wells dried in summer, their levels falling as heat thickened. In winter, ropes froze stiff, buckets cracked, ice formed across the surface. Settlers struck the crust with sticks, scooped through shards before filling. Each season changed its burden, yet the well endured, its darkness faithful, its water patient. Pause once more, its picture rising before dawn, lantern in hand, the sky still dark. You cross the yard, the ground stiff with frost, your breath a cloud before you. The well waits, silent, its frame stiff with ice. You lower the bucket, hear the splash, feel the rope stiff beneath your hands. The bucket rises, its surface steaming faintly as it meets the cold. You carry it back, your arms aching, your body warmed by effort alone. But even wells carried danger of sickness, without knowledge of what lay beneath. Some drew water fouled by seepage, its clarity deceiving, its taste sharp. Illness followed quietly, carried in cups and pots. Yet people drank, because they had no choice. On the frontier, water was never chosen. It was endured, accepted, carried, treasured, feared. Wells, streams, rivers, each was part of the same rhythm. They gave, they took, they reminded settlers that survival was not only in cabins or fields, but in patience with the land itself. To fetch, to guard, to dig, to carry, these acts were woven into every day, their repetition shaping the very memory of frontier life. Pause again. You hear the creak of the spindle, the splash of water below, the steady drip as the bucket is lifted. The sound is small, but in silence, it fills the air. A rhythm as steady as breath, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like water shimmering. In lantern light, on the edge of wilderness, was survival built by hands that raised cabins, intended fires, or by the patient act of drawing water, again and again, from stream, from river, from well. Each drop a fragile promise carried into another day, into another day. The snow lies heavy on the clearing, muffling every sound. The forest beyond is hushed, the branches stiff with frost, the ground brittle beneath drifts of ice. Inside the cabin, the fire glows, but its warmth does not reach every corner. The shadows stretch across the floor, and in that silence, another sound emerges, a cough, sharp and dry, breaking the stillness. Then another, And soon the rhythm of winter is joined by the rhythm of sickness. Pause here. Imagine sitting on a rough bench near the hearth. The air is heavy, filled with the smell of smoke, wool, and damp wood. You hear the fire crackle faintly, its light trembling across walls. Then the cough comes again, from the bed in the corner, followed by the soft murmur of reassurance. The sound is not loud, but it fills the cabin more than the fire does, reminding all within that survival on the frontier was threatened not only by cold and hunger, but by the frailty of the body. Illness came quietly in winter. Fevers rose in cabins where air was close, where smoke lingered, where windows stayed shuttered against drafts. Dysentery spread through water stored too long. Colds deepened into pneumonia. Small infections, a cut from wood, a burn from the hearth, became dangerous when left untreated. Frontier medicine was thin, often no more than herbs steeped in water, poultices pressed against skin, prayers whispered in silence. Pause again. You see a mother dipping a cloth in water, pressing it to the forehead of a child. The child stirs weakly, their breath shallow, their eyes half closed. The fire crackles, the wind moans outside, but the focus of the room narrows to that small bed, to the fragile weight of life resting within it. Disease did not strike alone. It came when bodies were already weakened by hunger, when cabins were crowded, when air was stale. Families huddled close for warmth, but closeness spread sickness as quickly as it shared heat. One cough became two, then many, and soon the entire cabin fell silent with weakness. There were no physicians nearby, no hospitals, no medicines beyond what nature offered. Sometimes neighbors came, bringing broth, herbs, or simply presents. More often, families endured alone, their prayers the only voices raised. Pause once more. You hear the sound of a pot bubbling faintly, a thin broth simmering on the fire. The smell is weak but comforting, its steam rising slowly into the air. Someone lifts the ladle, pours a small portion into a wooden bowl, and carries it gently to the sick bed. The cabin is hushed, every sound measured, every motion deliberate. For many, survival meant improvisation. Willow bark steeped in water for pain, pine needles boiled for tea, onions pressed into poultices. These remedies gave some relief, but not always enough. Children often died in winters when sickness lingered, their bodies too fragile to fight. Elders followed, their strength gone. Graves were dug in frozen ground, shallow and hard. Snow pressed over them, stones marking places where spring might bring grass again. The memory of such losses hung heavy in every winter that followed, shaping habits of prayer, of caution, of endurance. And yet, life continued around sickness. Fires still needed tending, animals fed, water fetched, meals made. The sound of labor carried on, even as silence deepened in corners where the sick lay. Survival on the frontier allowed no pause, even for grief. Each day demanded its tasks, and so families balanced care with endurance, moving through rhythms shaped by both life and loss. Pause again. You hear the crack of wood split outside, the muffled sound of boots in snow, the heavy creak of the door as someone returns carrying logs. Inside, the sick bed stirs, a voice whispers softly, and the fire is fed once more. Life continues, steady, fragile, unbroken, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like breath in cold air. In cabins pressed by hunger, cold, and silence, was survival truly measured by what fires and fields could provide, or by the fragile persistence of bodies that endured illness, carrying families through winters where even breath itself felt uncertain. Asterisk, the cough lingers, echoing faintly in the corners of the cabin. The fire glows, but cannot drive it away, nor can the blankets heaped high, nor the heavy shutters sealed against drafts. Illness has settled into the rhythm of the household, reshaping every sound, every breath, every motion. And so, in silence and necessity, frontier families turned to what remedies they could find, craft and care from forest, field, and memory. Pause here. Imagine the small table beside the hearth. On it lie bundles of dried herbs, sage, yarrow, chamomile, their stems brittle, their scent faint but sharp. A mortar sits nearby, its stone worn smooth by years of grinding. Beside it, a pot steams gently, the water tinted green with leaves. The air smells of pine, of smoke, of damp earth. You hear the stir of a spoon, the low whisper of someone praying as they mix. Medicine on the frontier was rarely learned in books, was carried in memory, passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, elder to youth. Willow barks steeped for fevers, honey mixed for sore throats, garlic crushed for strength, pine needles boiled for tea, rich in what later would be called vitamin C. These remedies were not cures, but they were comfort, small gestures against the weight of sickness, acts of care that gave body and spirit something to hold. Pause again. You picture a child sipping a cup of pine tea, their face drawn, their breath shallow. The taste is bitter, but warmth spreads through their body, their lips glistening with steam. A hand rests gently on their brow, the touch as important as the tea itself. Prayers were part of remedy too. Psalms murmured in the stillness, rosaries fingered slowly, blessings spoken over the sick. Faith was as much medicine as herbs, a way to steady the spirit when the body faltered. The candle burning beside the bed, its light flickering across pale faces, was both vigil and plea. In a world where physicians were distant and medicine scarce, faith filled the silence. Yet not all remedies soothed. Some were harsh mustard plasters pressed to skin, vinegar rubbed into wounds, purging draughts forced upon the weak. Families tried what they had heard, desperate for results, measuring hope against risk. Sometimes the sick grew stronger, sometimes they grew weaker still. Survival was as fragile as the remedies themselves, balanced between endurance and chance. Pause once more. Imagine the sting of a mustard plaster pressed against your chest, the heat burning, the skin reddening. You cough, you wince, you breathe shallowly. The air smells sharp, acrid, the firelight trembling against shadows. Belief is uncertain, but effort is everything. Community, when it existed, became medicine too. Neighbors walked miles through snow to bring broth, herbs, or simply company. A voice in the silence, a presence beside the bed, a story told softly to distract from pain. These were treatments as important as teas or poultices. Shared endurance was its own healing, reminding families that they were not entirely alone in wilderness. But death still came, often swiftly. A fever rising through the night, a cough deepening into silence, a body too weary to fight. Graves were dug in frozen ground, shallow and stiff, covered with snow until spring could soften the earth. Families mourned quickly, for survival allowed no long pause. The fire had to be tended, children fed, water carried. Grief joined hunger and cold as part of the rhythm, endured but not allowed to consume. Pause again. You hear the sound of a spade striking frozen earth, its ring sharp, echoing across the clearing. The air is still, the snow pale, the silence immense. The grave is shallow, but it is enough. A prayer is spoken, the words carried upward into frozen air. Then life continues, as it must. And so, remedies were more than herbs or prayers. They were acts of love, of persistence, of memory. Each cup of tea, each poultice, each whispered blessing was a thread that held families together against the unraveling of sickness. Whether or not the body healed, the act itself mattered. It reminded the sick that they were seen, that they were cared for, that even in silence and frailty, they were not abandoned. Pause once more. You picture the fire glowing, the pot steaming, the candle flickering beside the bed. The air is heavy, the shadows long, the night endless. Yet, in these small gestures, in herbs, in prayers, in presence, life continues, fragile but unbroken, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke into rafters on the frontier, a survival found in remedies that healed the body, or in the quiet devotion of those who tended the sick, reminding them through every act that they were not alone in the wilderness. Asterisk, the coughs that once echoed in the cabin began, slowly, to fade. Not all at once, not like a storm breaking, but in fragments. A day when the fever lessens, a night when breathing grows easier, a morning when the sick are able to sit upright. The cabin does not grow loud again, not yet. Its silence lingers, heavy with memory, but there is a change, a small loosening. Still the air itself begins to lift. Asterisk, pause here. Imagine sitting once more at the hearth. The fire burns brighter. Now the pot steams with broth, a little richer than before. The air smells of smoke and onions, herbs, and pine. Behind you, the bed where someone once lay weak is quieter, but this time with rest rather than struggle. Their breath comes steady, shallow but strong, and their hand stirs faintly, as though reaching back toward life, toward life. Recovery on the frontier was not quick. Bodies weakened by fever or infection took weeks to regain strength. Children rose slowly, their limbs thin, their laughter hesitant. Adults returned to work sooner, but their steps were heavy, their endurance thin. The cabin itself bore traces of sickness, blankets damp with sweat, air stale with smoke, herbs scattered across the floor, candles burned low at the bedsides. Survival was not a triumph, It was a weary continuation, a fragile return to labor. Pause. Again, you see a woman folding blankets, shaking them outside into cold air. The steam of breath rising as she beats dust from the cloth. You hear the faint sound of broom bristles against the floor, sweeping away herbs, dried and crushed. The smell of sickness lingers, but fresh air creeps in through the open door, carrying the sharpness of frost and pine. But not all returned. Some families faced recovery, mingled with grief. A child's bed left empty, a place at the table unfilled, a silence sharper than any cough. Graves on the hill remained, covered in snow, their presence visible each time eyes turned toward the horizon. Those who survived carried loss as much as relief, their patience stretched not only by hunger and cold, but by absence that lingered long after sickness passed. And yet, even with grief, life returned. The fire was fed, the animals tended, the water carried, work filled silence, shaping grief into rhythm. A father cut wood again, his arms weaker but steady. A mother baked bread, the dough thin but fragrant. Children fetched sticks, their laughter cautious but real. Each task was both necessity and healing, a way to weave life back into cabins where sickness had unraveled it. Pause once more. 8. You hear the sound of an axe striking wood outside, sharp and steady, echoing across frosted ground. You hear the bubbling of dough near the fire, the faint laughter of children playing with scraps of cloth. The cabin breathes differently now, not in the silence of fear, but in the quiet rhythm of return. Spring promised more than survival. Its first signs, the thaw of soil, the call of birds, the soft drip of melting snow, carried hope that sickness would loosen with the cold. Families gathered herbs fresh again, their green scent sharper, their presence stronger. They cleaned cabins thoroughly, sweeping out ash, opening shutters wide, airing blankets in sunlight. They whispered thanks and prayers, lit candles, not for plea, but for gratitude. Illness had not vanished, but it had passed, leaving patience in its place. In memory, sickness became another story of endurance, told in hushed voices at firesides, remembered each winter as warning and as proof. The year of fever, some said. The winter of coughing, said others. Names were given, not 2 months, but 2 trials endured, marking time not by calendars, but by survival. Pause again. You imagine yourself sitting in such a cabin months later, the fire steady, the air lighter. A voice tells the story of the sickness that passed, of the child who endured, of the neighbor who came through snow with broth, of the prayers whispered in the dark. The story is quiet, measured, but it carries weight, binding memory into the rhythm of the household. And so, the fragile return was not only about healing bodies. It was about remembering silence, about carrying forward the patience learned in illness, about weaving loss and relief into the same fabric of survival. Each winter left its mark, each sickness its story, each recovery its fragile gratitude. Pause once more. The fire burns, the cabin breathes, the family stirs. Outside, snow still lies heavy, but within, there is warmth again, faint but steady. The silence remains, but it is different now. Not the silence of fear, the silence of endurance that has carried another trial into memory. And you are left with a reflection that drifts like candle smoke into rafters. On the frontier, was survival truly measured in the healing of the sick, or in the way families wove sickness into the rhythm of life itself, carrying patience, grief, and gratitude together through winters that never ceased to test them? Asterisk, the wilderness pressed upon frontier cabins, not only with cold and hunger, not only with sickness and labor, but with silence that felt deeper than stone. Nights stretched long, mornings came slowly. Days passed without voices beyond those of family or the sound of wind in trees. Loneliness, as much as frost or famine, was a burden carried on the frontier. Pause here. Imagine yourself sitting by the hearth at dusk. The fire glows low, its embers pulsing faintly, its light casting orange across rough-hewn logs. The air smells of smoke and damp wool, of stew faintly simmering in a pot. Outside, the forest darkens, its branches groaning under frost, its silence deepening with night. No bells ring, no neighbors knock. Only the faint call of an owl breaks the stillness, reminding you that the wilderness itself listens. Loneliness was not absence alone, it was weight. Settlers who left towns or villages found themselves cut off from markets, churches, friends, kin. Days passed in labor without company, and evenings stretched long around small fires. Letters were rare, often months apart, carried by distant hands through forests and rivers. A voice from elsewhere was a luxury, and silence filled its place. Pause. Again, you hear the faint scratch of a quill against parchment as a letter is written by firelight. The words are simple, reports of health, of weather, of fields sown and harvested. The ink spreads unevenly, the handwriting careful but tired. The letter will not be answered for months, perhaps never. Still, it is written, for the act itself eases the silence. For some, solitude was a choice. Land was plentiful on the frontier, and isolation meant to claim acres of soil, woods for timber, rivers for water. To be alone was to hold more, yet the reward carried its price. Women wrote of days spent without another voice but their own, of children whose play was quieted by distance, of men whose labor grew heavier without the sound of others near. Loneliness seeped through shutters, pressed into corners, joined hunger and cold as part of survival. Communities formed slowly. Cabins gathered near one another, churches built, schools raised. But in the earliest years, before neighbors would near, silence shaped the mind. Some found peace in it, their prayers deeper, their patience steadier. Others faltered, their spirits dimmed, their tempers sharpened. Loneliness was not always endured. Quietly, it became anger, despair, fear. The wilderness was vast enough to swallow not only bodies, but voices. Pause once more. Picture a woman standing at the cabin door, looking out across fields, pale with frost. No smoke rises from another chimney. No figure crosses the snow. Only wind moves, carrying the faint creak of trees. She breathes deeply, her breath clouding, and turns back inside to silence that feels heavier than the night. Yet families endured loneliness with ritual. They told stories at night, voices rising softly above the fire. They sang hymns there, words filling the air where silence waited. They prayed aloud, even when no one answered, as though sound itself pushed back against emptiness. Children played in corners, their laughter fragile but present. Every act of speech, every note of song, every whispered word was resistance against silence. Neighbors, when they came, were treasured. A visitor's knock carried more than presence carried. Life itself carried meals stretched longer, stories poured forth, news carried across miles was listened to with care. A letter, read aloud, was savored line by line, its inked words filling air heavy with absence. Community, when found, was not convenience, but medicine, easing loneliness as surely as broth eased hunger. Pause again. You hear the sound of a knock at the door, the creak of its hinges, the sudden warmth of voices rising together. The fire glows brighter, though it has not changed. The silence is broken, and for a time, the cabin feels larger, lighter, steadier. But most nights remained quiet. After visitors left, after letters were read, after songs faded, silence returned. It pressed as heavily as frost, carrying with it both burden and patience. Some grew accustomed to it, even grateful for its steadiness. Others carried it as weight until spring brought neighbors closer, or until children grew, filling air with noise once more. Loneliness shaped frontier survival as much as woodcutting or hunting. It tested patience, demanded ritual, reminded families of the cost of distance. Yet, it also carved endurance into spirit, teaching that survival was not only fire against cold, or food against hunger, but voice against silence. Pause once more. You sit again by the hearth, the fire low, the cabin hushed. Outside, the wilderness stretches vast, its silence unbroken. Within, you hum softly, a tune without words, your voice carrying faintly through shadows. The sound is small, but it fills the air, a reminder that even here, even in silence, presence endures, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke against rafters on the frontier. Was survival truly shaped by cabins, fires, and fields, or by the strength to endure silence, filling it with stories, songs, and whispers until dawn returned? Asterisk. The cabin stands small against the wilderness, a thin line of smoke rising from its roof into a pale sky. Beyond its walls stretch miles of forest, a frozen river, of open plain. The silence inside is heavy, but the silence outside is faster still. To live on the frontier was to measure distance, not in minutes or hours, but in days. Loneliness was, not only within cabins, but in the endless miles that separated them from others. Pause here. Imagine walking away from the cabin door. The ground crunches beneath your boots, snow brittle, ice shining faintly in weak sunlight. Each breath rises as mist, vanishing quickly into the air. Before you lies the forest, dark and endless, its trunks straight and silent, its branches heavy with frost. You take a step, then another, and the cabin disappears behind you, swallowed by trees. The world grows larger, emptier, quieter. Journeys on the frontier were slow, shaped by terrain and weather. A trip to the nearest settlement might take hours, in summer, days in winter. Paths were rough, often no more than tracks beaten by wagons. Mud deep in rain, ruts frozen hard in frost. Rivers had to be forded, hills climbed, forests navigated by sun and star. Each journey carried risk, and so families traveled rarely, saving their strength for when need was great. The result was isolation so complete that months might pass without a voice from beyond the clearing. Pause again. You hear the sound of boots sinking in snow, the creak of leather straps, the faint jingle of a harness as a horse pulls a small sled. The forest is silent, but for these sounds, each one swallowed quickly by the vastness. The distance feels endless, though the settlement may lie only a few miles away. Letters crossed miles too, carried by riders or wagons. Their paper folded carefully, their ink faint but precious. A single letter might take weeks to arrive, months to be answered. Families read them aloud again and again, savoring each word, each mention of weather, of births, of deaths. The words themselves were less important than the reminder that others still lived, still thought of them, still spoke their names. Between letters, silence reigned. Even when neighbors existed, they were often miles apart. Visits required planning, days when weather permitted, when work allowed. A knock at the door was a rare gift, its sound echoing louder than any song. Shared meals stretched long, news exchanged carefully, laughter louder than it would be in towns. But when the visit ended, when boots crunched away into forest, when silence returned, the emptiness of distance felt sharper still. Pause once more. Picture the end of such a visit. The door closes, the cabin grows quiet again. The fire burns low, the bowls are stacked, the laughter has faded. You sit in the silence, hearing only the crackle of wood, the faint sigh of wind. The emptiness feels larger now, as though the miles beyond have pressed closer. Children felt the miles too. They grew with fewer companions, their games quieter, their laughter shared only with siblings. They learned early to endure solitude, to speak softly, to listen closely. Their toys were carved from wood, their stories told by elders, their play shaped by silence. Loneliness pressed upon them gently, but it marked them deeply, carving patience into their days. And yet, solitude shaped resilience. Families learned to lean upon themselves, to weave their own stories, to build strength in silence. The songs were sung not for others, but for the air itself, hymns rising into rafters, lullabies echoing in small rooms. Stories became community, carrying memory across miles. Silence remained, but it was filled, however faintly, by sound that persisted. Pause again. You hear the faint hum of a hymn, low and steady, sung not for congregation, but for the night itself. The voice carries softly, filling the cabin, filling the silence. The wilderness remains vast, but within, presence lingers. Loneliness was never conquered. It remained as constant as frost, as patient as hunger, as steady as rivers. But families endured it, shaping it into habit, carrying it across miles as they carried water, wood, and food. To live on the frontier was to live with distance, with absence, with silence. It was to measure life, not in noise, but in endurance, and you were left with a reflection that drifts like breath across frozen air. On the frontier, did survival rest only in cabins in fields, or in the strength to endure empty miles, filling silence with voices of one's own until spring brought neighbors near again? Asterisk, the silence of the frontier was not absolute. It pressed long and heavy through winters. It stretched across empty miles, but eventually voices returned. Spring brought more than thawed soil and running streams. It brought neighbors emerging from their own cabins, its families walking through forest paths, wagons creaking along rutted roads. Where loneliness had weighed heaviest, presence returned, fragile but real, filling the air once more. Pause here. Imagine the first knock at the door after months of silence. The sound is sharp, echoing louder than the crackle of the fire, startling in its suddenness. You rise, open the heavy door, and see a figure wrapped in cloak and furs, their breath rising in clouds. Their face is familiar, a neighbor who has walked miles, a friend unseen since autumn. Their voice rises, rough from disuse, carrying greetings shaped by distance and winter endured. The cabin feels lighter the moment they step inside. Visits in spring were more than company. They were proof of survival. To see a neighbor alive was to know that silence had not swallowed them. To hear their voice was to remember that the frontier was not entirely empty. Families exchanged news with urgency, who had fallen sick, who had endured hunger, who had been lost. Losses were shared, but so too were triumphs. A birth carried safely, a field that survived frost, a calf born strong in winter. Each word carried weight, filling silence with memory and with meaning. Pause again. You hear voices rising around the hearth, laughter mingling with prayer. Bowls pass from hand to hand. The fire glows brighter, though it has not changed. Air smells of bread and broth, richer now with company. The silence has lifted, if only for a night. Churches, when they could be reached, were gatherings where silence finally broke. Hymns rose loud in wooden chapels, prayers spoken in chorus, voices layered together until rafters trembled. Families who had seen no others for months stood side by side, their breath mingling in the cold air. For many, this was survival as much as food or fire, the reminder that they belonged, that others endured the same burdens, that silence was not eternal. Children felt the change most sharply. After months of play confined to siblings or solitude, they rushed eagerly toward others, their laughter ringing across fields, their games filling air that had lain heavy with quiet. Their voices carried far, startling birds from trees, reminding the wilderness that presence had returned. Pause once more. Picture a field on a spring afternoon. Children run across its thawing soil, their boots kicking clumps of frost, their shouts rising into sky. Parents watch, smiling faintly, their faces tired but warmed by sound. The forest edges seemed less heavy, the air less still. Silence, though never gone, has loosened its hold, yet loneliness never vanished. Even in summer, even with neighbors, the frontier remained vast, its distances unyielding. Silence returned with each evening, pressing close. Once visitors departed, once voices faded, once doors closed. But families carried spring with them, storing memory of company as they stored food for winter. Loneliness was endured more easily when broken by presence, even briefly. Letters, too, brought voices back. Though months late, their words filled cabins with sound. Read aloud, their ink seemed to speak, carrying laughter, grief, advice, love across hundreds of miles. Each letter was read again and again until the paper frayed, until words blurred with use. In them, silence dissolved, if only for moments. And so, survival on the frontier was not only about endurance and silence, but about treasuring sound when it returned. Every voice was sacred, every visit remembered, every hymn sung with weight. Silence might define winters, but voices define spring. Pause again. You sit by the hearth, a letter in your hands, its words spoken aloud. Others listen, their eyes fixed on firelight, their faces softened by memory. Outside, the night is silent, but within, the letter carries presence, the voice of one absent filling the room. Loneliness, in the end, was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a companion, patient, steady, demanding, teaching families to endure silence as much as cold. But the voices that returned, neighbors at doors, children in fields, hymns in chapels, words on paper reminded them why endurance mattered. Life was not measured only in meals or fires. but in the sound of presence breaking silence, however briefly. Pause once more. The fire glows low. The night stretches long. The wilderness presses near. But you hear voices in memory, laughter, prayer song, carried forward into silence. They linger, soft but steady, filling the cabin long after they have faded, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like an echo across empty miles on the frontier of survival found only in fire, food, and shelter. All in the fragile voices that returned, reminding each family that silence, though vast, was never absolute.